Anyhow, welcome everyone. We're going to talk today about the topic of this conference, universality and universal content management from an editorial and marketing perspective. I want to introduce our panelists real quickly. We have Jeff Eaton from Autogram, Rebecca Wyatt from Enterprise Knowledge, and Guy Brown from Crown Peak. Sorry, it took a second. And what I'd like to do is begin. We have just one mic, so I'll be passing this around. I'll just go kind of order we just introduced folks. I'd love you to each talk a little bit about the notion of universality, universal content management. I know this is big, and I'll give you a hook if you get going to it. But I'd love to just get your sort of overview of this notion of universality, the vision of a universal CMS that Preston set out, and how it fits in your world. Because you each kind of come from like enterprise architecture and systems and linguistics and people stuff and learning and enablement stuff and architecture and systems. So Jeff, I will hand the mic to you.
So just small question. What is universality? I think this is basically a problem that our industry, and I mean that very broadly, like people who work with text professionally, or like to that level. I think that's something that they've been dealing with for as long as we have had systems to manage this stuff. Like the question of how do you make a thing that works multiple times and you can reuse and in different places. Like that goes back to even just in markup languages, that goes back to like the 50s and 60s when IBM was making ML markup language. Like they didn't, no letters before it even. And so in one sense, like this challenge isn't new, but it feels like we keep hitting different plateaus of like, haha, we've figured out how to go beyond ASCII, hooray. And we keep marching forward, and there's interesting advances, like HTML alone was, the structural purists were frustrated by it, but it brought a whole new world of, use cases to that. Now, everything's on the web. But that suddenly meant that we had this much more diverse pool of scenarios that we had to deal with. Then suddenly everybody had been building stuff on the web, and now they needed to do it for phones or for watches or for their signage, or they had print materials they also needed to keep in sync. Some people had been, using Data for everything forever, but, like that was a shift that came after that. So like, the inflection point that we're talking about now, we're like, hey, we've got all these different modular tools that we can put together. We've got these different ways of managing stuff. Everybody's, creating things and reusing it and firing it into all these different display channels. That's a new challenge in one way, but at the same time, it's like exactly the same story we've been dealing with in cycles over and over and over. So like, I think the interesting thing for me is figuring out what's the new stuff at play here that we need to like ideate about and just throw stuff at the wall and say what works, and what is the proven stuff we have to like dip back into what people were talking about in the 90s to go back and figure out some interesting solutions. Like I think it's going to be a mix of both of those.
All right, so universality. I work in a knowledge management consultancy, right? That's kind of our bread and butter, and we talk a lot about semantics and the common universal element behind all of this. Why do we even create content? We create it to create meaning, and what is the structure behind that? What are all of those common elements, and how do we bring them all together? We do a lot of work doing semantic models and then plugging content models into those semantic models, using those for the context that we need. And, humans don't do well with structure unless there's context built around it. We need that context. And so we need it in our authoring environments. We need that context in the way all of these various components talk to each other. So I think just the idea of building that context and creating meaning with it is, philosophically where any sort of approach to universality has to be rooted.
Okay, so universality. I guess from my perspective, taking things a lot more literal and being quite a technical person in nature. And when it comes to things like CMS, universality means to me being applicable to all things. So essentially removing the word architecture from the conversation. There shouldn't be different types of content management systems based on architecture alone, because they should be relevant to everything. There should be diversity and flexibility in content distribution at the bottom layer, and then the content management system above should be able to cope with the diversity of the needs of the content that needs to be distributed, whether it's headlessly, whether it's statically generated, or whether it's delivered natively within the CMS. So universality to me means applicable to everything. It means diversity of content distribution. It means being an enabler to match all the different channels that are out there. And yes, to your point earlier on, how can you possibly spot every perceivable channel? In some ways it is impossible, but in other ways you could say things that were thought impossible 12 months ago, 24 months ago were. And I think that's another part of the universal CMS, is being flexible and extensible, so that if you choose a universal CMS platform, next year when something new comes along, you should be able to plug in that preview engine for that particular thing. So I realised that was a very kind of specific and technical answer, rather than a more kind of esoteric kind of, this is how content should be managed universally, but that's kind of what it means to me.
That's exactly why we invited you to the panel. So thank you for that perspective.
Yeah, just the techie to get more practical and focused in on that.
Perfect mix of folks. But hey, I want to harken back to something that Jeff and Rebecca said. You reminded me of my favorite ontologist, is Dean Alamang, who literally wrote the book on the semantic web. I don't play favorites, but anyhow. But Dean is famous for constantly saying, say what you mean and mean what you say. And in the context of to what Rebecca just said, but I'm also thinking back to what we talked about in our prep call about the role of language and linguistics in content. I'm wondering if either or both of you, Jeff and Rebecca, have anything to add. Does that evoke anything in terms of that kind of thinking as the foundation for a universal editing or management tool?
If I can, as soon as you said what you were talking about with the semantic and meaning and communicative nature of content, I was thinking about how critical that is at the heart of what we're talking about. Because I think Dean Barker and everyone have had conversations about what's the difference between just data management and content management. And I think that even, touches on stuff that Preston was talking about. And fundamentally, what separates data from content is that content is communicative. Content is a message from some kind of perspective, whether it's, a person or an organization or whatever, and it has an intended audience. And if it's successful, it has conveyed that message. And it's very easy to get sucked into the technical details of all of the interchange formats we're going to need to have and how we're going to hook metadata onto that and stuff like that. But at its heart, what we're doing is capturing the nature of the message. And I think the places where, as an industry, we've gone down potentially damaging rabbit trails are when we've lost sight of the fact that there is actually a meaningful thing underneath a bunch of HTML and a bunch of images and, workflows and stuff like that. And we get too deep into that and lose sight of the fundamental messaging aspect of it. At that point, we might as well be throwing JPEGs around. No. Nothing against JPEGs.
So I love that. And this maybe is more appropriate for a bar conversation, but I'm going to say it here anyway. The idea that, that line, well, you can imagine that working in a knowledge management consultancy, there are a lot of good-natured debates about the distinction between content and data. And the line that you draw, that content is designed from its core to communicate something, is, fascinating to me, right? Because a lot of what we spend our time doing, as knowledge managers is actually curating data to tell a story, mapping it all together. And again, that word context, creating the context around it. And then at that point, when maybe it wasn't originally created to tell a story, but when you put it on a page, when you put it in a digital experience and it begins to tell a story, does it translate to becoming content at that point? It's
I would
interesting.
say it does. That's how data gets turned into content. It's that adding that layer of human intent and message to what might otherwise be a CSV file or something like that. And I think, as we start talking about how do we build tools that allow people to manage and edit these things regardless of how they're going to appear in lots of different places, part of that is a visual challenge, like how do we allow people to visually manipulate things? And another part of it is making sure that we make it possible and easy for them to capture what that underlying intent is for them. Not just, it's got to be blue and go here, but this goes with that other thing that has a blue square over here. They're communicating connectedness, and the tool they've got is slap a blue square right there. Any time we can give them ways to capture the intended connection or the intended emphasis or something like that, we make it orders of magnitude easier to show these two things are related to each other, or this is most important, or this comes next, and this is additional information on the side, or whatever. Capturing that intent, like the semantics of it, like why this is here and why it's connected, that makes the restructuring and the reflowing way easier to do on the edge.
Can I frame this just a little bit, Guy? I just want, because I want your perspective, but I'm just curious, and you're probably going to say this, but just your perspective of like the architectural look at this in terms of manifesting and supporting that intent and meaning that underlies it. That's what I'm hoping you were going to say.
Kind of, yeah. I was just going to comment on the difference between content and data. Content, it's creativity, it's emotion, it's designed to kind of get something across. And I think that's why we always come back to things like visual editors, basically, because, maybe headless CMS are more on the data side of content management, whereas, traditional monoliths with visual editors are more on the creative side. And I think that's why there's been a little bit of a backlash against things like headless CMSs. And it's always going to be the case that to do something creative, and most creative people do need something visual to hook behind, or they need to be able to see it come to life. Just as the end user that consumes the content needs that visual representation. It'd be akin to showing a web page that's just white text. It's not going to get across the point. It's about an emotional connection between the content rather than just the data. If it was just the data, then everyone's life would be much easier. We'd probably all not have a job, but that's another conversation. But from an architectural point of view, and I think, why the universal CMS resonated is because it's trying to separate those two things at the same time as bringing them together. Giving the content a kind of, a place to belong, that it can be brought together both visually but also distributed to many different channels at the same time. It's like multi-layered, multifaceted kind of management, visualization, distribution layer, the three things that Preston put together. And I don't think many content management systems out there do that very well. They're either this type or that type, and there's nothing in the middle that can bring them both together.
It seems like a lot of this we're talking about is like, in terms of like building CMSs or building architectures that support this stuff. There's that part of it, but then there's like the stitching it all together. How do you keep that stuff together? It seems to me like this might fall in the realm of enterprise UX, this kind of emerging discipline about design, because that seems like what we're talking about. Like, have to design these systems so that it can, I don't know, is it like are you thinking of like a no code, low code editing visual thing that captures the semantics as it goes, or I guess what is the user experience that these systems can be supporting, and how might we support those? Does the question make sense, and thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Yeah, I mean,
We're just sharing a nervous laugh.
I mean, in relation to things like no code, low code, I mean, to me, it needs to be everything. It needs to be all those things. It needs to be able to support low code, no code. It also needs to be able to work in a very complex enterprise environment. And I think that's why I talked about having diversity of content management, content distribution. You know, it's not just about the features that people apply into CMS systems that allow them to do nice things. It's what happens to that content beforehand. And, you know, headless CMS has started with maybe the right thought process. You know, it got to the point where the kind of single technology approach was stifling teams. You know, different types of channels were exploding. We needed something to be able to seed content to lots of different channels. And so the headless CMS came along and kind of promised that on channel delivery, didn't it? But they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater and ended up just giving us a database that you could then go and build all of the other stuff outside of the CMS to support that, without realizing that most organizations probably weren't adept enough to be able to do that for them, basically. And it's only now that they're starting to realize that actually maybe the baby was quite important and we need to kind of bring it back inside. And I think for me, it is, as I said, about being able to support many things different once. We need to be able to support headless delivery. We need to be able to support content delivery that we can publish out to endpoints. We need simple mechanisms inside the CMS to actually manage them, both for the content and the presentation. And having that kind of diversity of that content management and content distribution will allow different teams with different levels of sophistication to use the same platform to be able to work with the content structures they need to get that message across to people.
What you just described is not an insignificant challenge. But that sort of gets at, like, one of the benefits of treating content as data is that you have a chance of doing that. That if you got the content abstracted out, described as data in a layer in that thing, and then you have semantics to stick it back together.
And the content is data. It there exists as data, but it needs someone to put meaning on top of it. And that's why all these other layers are needed for different channels in different ways to put the meaning on top of it. Because as Preston said, at the end of the day, content's about people. As a CMS vendor, we can give them all the different layers they need to manage that, but we need the people to come and put meaning to it, and we need to give them the right tools to be able to put meaning on it.
And in addition to the tools, I know Rebecca and I were talking a little while ago about enablement, that once you don't just hand them the tool and it happens. Can you talk a little bit about that, Rebecca?
So technology, it turns out, cannot solve all of our problems by itself. There is a need to help people understand how to work within these complex frameworks. And this is something that historically I think software vendors have not done particularly well. We provide documentation of a technical system. That is not how you enable complex performance. There is a whole methodology around performance support. It is okay for software vendors to document how their software works, but that is not how you enable people to use the software. You reference that documentation when you want to enable people to use software, and the materials that you create for people, that needs to be organized by the specific tasks that they are trying to complete. That's the documentation that's custom, that needs to be created for every single individual user of your software. It can link back to the technical documentation, and it should. You shouldn't create duplicate content. I hope I'm preaching to the choir on that one. But what you need to put in front of people who are trying to use that really needs to be specific to the business process and the tasks within those business processes that they're trying to achieve.
Jeff, did you want?
I was just going to agree with that vigorously and say that I think that actually is one of the reasons it's a challenging product problem, because by definition, a product is trying to choose some specific tasks and use cases and workflows to optimize for, and it's a tough line to walk, saying we want to build a tool that allows everybody, in theory, to manage their special messaging and all the places where it goes. But like you were saying, what tasks are involved in that? that varies from organization to organization. What is the nature of the messages that they care about? A company that's, publishing technical documentation is going to have very different structures and needs for reflowing and reusing things than an event management company that's promoting stuff and cycling through things, but uses certain kinds of assets that are connected to domain objects, not necessarily the whole assembly. I think figuring out how to do more than just bake certain tasks and decide this is how we do X as an industry, but rather dig into how we construct complicated tasks and complicated messages and allow people to build the tools they need to work with that stuff. I guess that's a big task.
Yeah, I was just going to make a point on that. I think as vendors, we're spectacularly bad at giving people the right kind of documentation. But if you think about CMS, it's everything to everyone. It's like a blank canvas. Someone can build any type of experience using a CMS that can support anyone. So trying to put documentation that help individual teams do that is very difficult. And I think as well, a lot of that pushes to the agencies, the developers building on it, because the experience that a customer might have or a user might have could be very specific to how that agency has implemented the CMS. And there's ways that you can implement it badly, there's ways you can implement it goodly, and you ask any customer over multiple CMS vendors and they'll give you very different stories depending on how the CMS has been implemented by the particular agency as to whether it's very good. And I think as an industry we kind of almost shy away from providing that level of documentation because we can't envisage all the different ways that it can be used, which creates a massive hole, not just for people using it, but also people building the software on top of it. And I don't know. I think that's probably more of a bigger challenge than working out how to build a visual editor for every single channel in the world.
I'm reminded now of a conversation, I can't remember who I was talking to about, that all vendors have opinions. They're opinionated. That's how they form companies and have ideas and form unique selling propositions and get money and build products and stuff. But I'm wondering and part of that opinion might be jumping ahead of the game to how to solve these problems. Whereas I'm wondering from a CMS product development perspective, is if you back down to that level of abstract out, how do we build a system that enables the people to enable task accomplishment better? That's a convoluted way of saying that, designing these systems a little bit differently. Does that make sense? That idea of designing for that task accomplishment over data capture or presentation thing or delivery. Does that ringing any bells for folks?
A little bit. I think we do that, and that's part of the reason why there are so many permutations of content management systems. There's so many different flavors of what that looks like, because the vocabulary that people use, the way that they organize their content, it's so different in every discipline, right? A learning management system is effectively a specific type of content management system, but it speaks to that audience, and it does have unique features that are necessary within that space. One that's not as big of a leap, there's specific platforms for marketing teams. We're here to talk about marketing. And they organize groups of content around campaigns, and that is reflected in the language of the product itself and the way that the information and the content is organized. So, from a product standpoint, we do that to a certain extent. It does fragment the industry somewhat. There's a lot of variation and functionality across those systems. I don't know that that's ever really going to go away. But within the kind of pure content management space, there's a level of purity in that. And what we're trying to do within CMSs is create content, organize it, and create a large variety of digital experiences. We're taking on a lot when we try to do that. I don't know that it's going to be, and I don't know that it's possible really to, within the product itself, solve for all those variations in the way people work. But we can, I think, build context around the core set in the same way that when you're creating a content model, You create a core set of, this is what how our content is structured, and these are the relationships between the content. We can certainly do that with core product features that are necessary to manage it, and then again, provide that varying context.
I was just going to say that, I mean, one of the things that we've found sometimes is that even more than anticipating every possible use, scenario of use and trying to tailor something for it, is recognizing when use cases are emerging that don't fit the tools well. There's actually a William Gibson quote. I think it might be from Johnny Mnemonic, but the book. But there's some line in which somebody says the street finds its own use for things, and that's every time I find like JavaScript in the zip code field. That's what I think of. It's like it's not that someone was just dumb and didn't understand the tool. Well, 9 times out of 10, let's say, but like that was an unmet need or something that was maybe possible, but they didn't have any documentation that made it clear here's how you would accomplish X using these tools. And they just figured out how with the stuff at hand, whether it was, well, okay, I don't know how we do this, but we've got a visual editor, so we're going to put some stuff up in the top left, and we're going to make this big, and we're going to stick these 3 pieces of content here, and okay, that's what my job was today, and I got to do this, and I've got these tools. Like, that process, I think, happens a lot. And figuring out how to identify when they're not necessarily doing what they want to do, they're just kind of using whatever they can get their hands on to accomplish what they have to do. Recognizing those scenarios, I think, can be really important, because we can look closer at those and figure out where we're missing the mark or where we could adapt or polish something without necessarily having to imagine every potential scenario.
Guys, like nodding a lot.
Yeah, I was just thinking what you're saying when you were talking, and I think from my experience, the best situations I've seen is where a customer obviously understands their business intuitively, they understand the people that are working on it, and they almost create a process and documentation around what they're doing as an organisation. And I think it's surprising how many organisations implement the CMS, throw it over there and just expect everyone to just jump in and use it. Because most of the time those things are tailored around their own business processes, their own content structure, how they want people to use it. And it comes back to that kind of principle around CMSs are for people, and also if you want people to be able to use it properly, you need that kind of structure in place, that training program in place, rather than just throwing it in hoping it will stick and people will figure out what to do, because generally they don't, basically. And organisations that know that before they enter into a project where they're implementing a CMS, where they've got a defined internal structure that they can educate people about how to do it, provide documentation, tend to be very successful using it. Unfortunately, that tends to be only a small percentage of people that are doing it.
I realized that the way I phrased that question and the way you all answered it, I'm just realizing that like what we probably need is a dynamic, robust CMS productscape that we can all pick stuff from, and we're all going to have unique needs to fulfill them. Hey, but we're coming up close to time. I want to see if there's any questions in the audience. Yeah.
I have a question. So if we had a time machine, went back to 2001, we would talk about multi-channel content, ontologies, content versus code, yet here we are. So why haven't we fixed this in 23 years, and what's different this time?
I'm looking at Guy because he's the most technical. I don't want to be mean, though.
All the good solutions demoed terribly.
Did you want to tackle that guy? I don't know. I'm seriously, I don't want to put you on this spot. You're responsible for the last 23 years of failure on the part of the industry. No, it's like, no.
I was in a vendor for 23 years, so I'm the
Okay, so let's see if we can fix his problem. But seriously, but that is a good question. Like, how have we advanced so little with so much knowledge at our disposal?
All the same stuff. It's literally all the same stuff.
Yeah.
I think mostly it's just insanely difficult to actually get everyone to rally around that same idea. Everyone's got their own thought process. Everyone's got a particular aim, and also people on their backs wanting commercial success in one way or the other. Everyone's trying to find their niche around how they can stand out differently from the market. And no one really wants to be the Me Too. No one really wants to be all together. They want to try and differentiate themselves. You know, we're the next super duper hybrid headless CMS, and we do different things differently to everyone else. And they set down that road where they kind of find it difficult to move back both. And you can see that's happened with both monolithic and headless CMSs. You know, they kind of diverged at a certain point, and rather than going, okay then, well, we do need to be able to find a better way to separate content and tech together. So why don't we kind of take the best of both worlds and put it together? But they didn't. They kind of went, I think I know better. I'm going to go down that route. My approach is more technical based, so I just want a database I can work with. So that's the way I'm going to go. And I think a lot of it is people. Again, it comes down to people. You know, having the right kind of group of people to work out what the superset of those kind of things were. And there's nothing like learning from your mistakes. I think we've got down this road 25 years later, and we've learned that actually you can't go one direction or the other. And I'm hoping that we will all converge and we'll all come together just for the sake of the industry, because having those two different tranches is hurting everyone, basically. You know, especially users. I mean, I don't know people buying CMSs. You know, most people buying CMSs, they're making a decision based on the architecture of a platform. They have no idea. They don't understand what difference the architecture is going to make and what ramifications are going to happen in the long run. Some companies, you know, maybe go headless because they've got an incredible tech team and they can make a real success of it. But a lot of people can't, and that's why those initiatives fails. Or they go with a monolithic CMS and they get trapped into that kind of single channel paradigm. And I think that's why, as vendors, we have a responsibility to try and enable all these different things to help people go together. I mean, that's my aspirational way. Whether or not there's people who pay the bills in the background saying, no, go that way, we'll see.
Well, I mean, I want to be hopeful about that, right? I think that we are in a place where there is some enabling technology that's a little bit more robust, certainly in the ontology space. There's certainly a critical mass of understanding and common language around, well, how we create common language. Like the semantic space is a little bit more disciplined than maybe it has been in the past. You know, when I know my team, when we build a product content model, we look at schema.org and we start with, okay, what is a product? And we try to build something that's interoperable. We're better at data management and those types of things now. And I think that certainly helps us to create those systems that can actually enable these types of experiences.
Makes sense.
I think ultimately it's because we keep wanting to do more stuff with our stuff. And like, if you look back 20 years, the idea that, you know, it's like, oh, well, I'd like to go into a program and I'd like to make something that will be able to reflow into, you know, 11 different devices and still be really, you know, really pop. Also, it'll be performant on all of those devices, and I'll be able to reuse it when my design changes 4 years from now. Like, well, good luck. I hope you like regular expressions, because that's how you're going to do that. You know, I mean, we have pushed the ball forward considerably as like an industry, but we've worked ourselves to a place where the kinds of things we're trying to build are language-like, not Lego-like. I mean, I love Lego analogies, but like it's actually closer to saying, like, what if we made Esperanto? And that's a complicated space. We're trying to figure out highly flexible ways people can take little tiny reusable modules and build arbitrary things with them to communicate messages that can be repurposed in lots of different forms and formats. And it's like, well, that's language. That's, you know, these building blocks of meaning that we have. And to a certain extent, there's a lot we can do to improve the experience, but accepting and working with the fact that we are trying to do something complicated that's tied up in how humans communicate, that helps us. It helps avoid fooling ourselves into thinking it's just a feature issue.
Victoria, how are we on time? Should we? Okay, go ahead. We'll give.
Okay, I've got a quick question.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff, Rebecca, and Guy. And we'll wrap it up here. Thanks, everyone.